Warden Perry Callahan was 51 years old, a state game warden posted to the Copper River district of Interior Alaska, and in the last week of September in 1974, he drove out to a poaching call that would take the rest of his life to finish reporting. The call came from a homeowner named Ione, who ran a trap line along a drainage northeast of the road system, a place most people never had a reason to go. She had radioed in about a bull moose killed and left, which meant somebody had shot 1,000 pounds of legal winter meat and walked away from it. And that was the kind of thing Callahan drove out to write a citation for. He had done it 100 times. He knew what a poached moose looked like from a distance. The dark heap in the grass, the birds already working it. But what he found in that clearing was not a poached moose.
The bull was down on its side with its hindquarters opened, and standing over it with one hand resting on the flank of the animal was something Callahan first read as a man in a fur coat, then as a bear risen onto its back legs, and then as neither. It was over 7 feet tall. It was covered in dark rust-brown hair that shaded to charcoal down the spine, and its face was wide and flat and human in a way that stopped his breath, more Neanderthal than ape. A heavy, bony brow ridge and a broad, prominent nose and no muzzle at all. And rising off the top of the skull, branching up and out past the height of a grown man, was a rack of antlers. Callahan sat in his truck 200 yards off and did not reach for the radio. The thing turned its head and looked at him with flat, reflective eyes. And it did not run, and it did not charge. It simply watched him the way a landlord watches a tenant who is late, and then it bent and took the moose by a hind leg and dragged 800 pounds of animal into the tree line without any apparent effort at all. He filed the call as a bear predation. That was the word he wrote, bear, because there was no box on the form for the other thing, and because he had already decided in the 20 minutes it took him to stop shaking that he was not going to be the warden who wrote down what he had actually seen. He was a year from his pension. He had a wife in Glen Allen and a daughter at the university in Fairbanks. He wrote bear. It was not the last carcass. Over the following 14 months, Perry Callahan would drive out to 11 more of them, and every single one was arranged the same way, and by the end of that run, he had stopped filing reports at all, because the reports he did file were disappearing out of the district office before the ink was dry. This is his account. He gave most of it to a nephew in 1994, 4 years before he died, and the rest of it was reconstructed from a field notebook that his daughter kept. What follows is that account in his order, as close to his own telling as it can be put. I want to start by saying I was not a man who believed in anything. I want that understood before I say the rest of it. I had been a warden for 26 years by the fall of 1974. I had seen everything the country up there could do to an animal or to a person. I had pulled drowned men out of the copper in June, and I had seen what a sow grizzly does to a hunter who gets between her and a cub, and none of it ever made me think there was more to the woods than the woods. The woods were just a place where things ate other things, and my job was to make sure the eating happened inside the seasons and the bag limits, and that was all it ever was to me. So when I say that the thing standing over the moose that belonged to Ione was not a bear, I need you to understand that I was the last man in that district who would have wanted it to be anything else. The clearing was maybe 4 acres, an old burn that had grown back to grass and fireweed ringed by black spruce. I came up the drainage on the game trail because the truck could not go the last mile, and I smelled the kill before I saw it. That wet copper smell that hangs low. And then I came out of the trees, and there it was in the open in the last good light of the afternoon, and I froze the way an animal freezes, because every part of me that was older than my thinking mind had already understood that I was looking at a predator and that I was in its country. It was taller than the moose at the shoulder, and a bull moose is a big animal. Its arms were long and thick and hung past the hips. The hands were the thing I kept coming back to for years afterward, because they were hands, they had 4 fingers and a thumb, and they closed and they gripped, and it had one of them flat on the side of the dead moose, like a man leaning on the hood of a car. And the head was the head of a man made wrong and made huge, the brow shelved out over the eyes, the jaw heavy, the nose broad and flat, and the whole face weathered a gray-brown like old driftwood, and off the crown of it grew the antlers. I want to be careful here, because for 20 years I have gone back and forth on whether they grew out of the skull or whether the thing had somehow taken them and worn them, and I never settled it. And neither did anyone else who saw the thing across those months. They were moose antlers, or they were shaped like moose antlers, palmate and broad and swept back, and they rose off the head to a spread wider than my outstretched arms. There was one more thing, and I only saw it because the light caught it when the thing turned. The top of the left ear had a notch torn out of it, an old healed wound, a piece missing clean. I would come to know that notch. I would see it again on the worst night of my life. I did not report what I saw. I have made my peace with lying about it for as long as I did, because a man has to be able to keep his job and keep his family fed. And there was no version of the truth I could have written in October of 1974 that would not have ended with me pensioned off early as a drunk. But I filed it as a bear, and Ione read the report because it was her moose, and Ione came to my office and closed the door. She was a Copper River homesteader who had trapped that drainage for 30 years, and her people had trapped it before her, and she was not a woman given to nonsense. She sat down across from my desk and she said, "That was no bear." And I said, "Ione." And she said, "You know it was no bear. You were closer to it than I was, and you know exactly what it was." And I did not say anything, and she nodded like my silence was the only honest answer I had given her. And she told me the rest of it, the part I had not known. She told me the drainage had gone wrong that summer. She ran a long line up that valley for marten and lynx, and the animals had emptied out of it. Not trapped out, emptied. Her sets stopped producing in July. She found her marten boxes torn open and not robbed, just torn, opened up and set aside. And she told me that the thing I would not name in my report had been in her valley since the snow left, and that the reason there was a dead moose was not that the thing was hungry. The reason there was a dead moose, she said, was that the moose had antlers, and the thing did not like anything else in its country wearing a crown. I thought she was building a story. I want to be honest that in that moment, in my warm office in October, I thought this hard old woman was building herself a story to explain a bad year on her line, and I let her talk. And I did not believe the shape of what she was telling me. It took me until the following spring to believe it, and by then it was much too late to unknow. The second carcass came in November, and it was not a moose. A trapper named Doug ran a line on the far side of the same ridge system, a younger man, mid-30s, ambitious, the kind who overextends his line and then cannot check it fast enough. He came into the office to report that he had lost a dog. He had a team of 6, and he ran them on the trap line, and one of them, his wheel dog, the big steady one, had gone into the spruce after something at a rest stop and had not come out. And when Doug went in after him, he found the dog 40 feet off the trail, up in the crotch of a spruce tree, 11 feet off the ground, wedged into the branches. Nothing in interior Alaska puts a 60-pound dog 11 feet up a tree. A wolverine cannot. A bear does not. Doug knew that, and Doug had not come to my office to file a predation report. He had come because he wanted me to tell him what could do that, and he wanted me to say a name he could live with. And I could not give him one because the only thing I had ever seen that could reach 11 feet up a spruce and set a dead dog into the branches, like a man stocking a shelf, was standing over the moose that belonged to Ione in September with a crown of antlers on its head. Doug told me his other dogs would not go up the valley anymore. He said they would lie down in the traces and refuse, and that he had never in his life seen a working dog refuse a trail, and that when he tried to force them, the lead dog turned around and bit through the line to get loose. Animals knew, he said. Animals knew what was up that valley, and they were not going. And he wanted to know why the animals knew and he did not. I told him to run his line somewhere else that winter. It was the only true and useful thing I said to him. He looked at me for a while, and then he said, "You have seen it." And I did not answer. And he left, and he moved his line 30 miles south for the rest of the season, and he lived. And I have always thought that the not answering was the one time I did right by somebody in that whole affair. There was a thing Doug told me on his way out the door that I did not write down for a week because I did not want it in the book. He said that the night before he found the dog in the tree, something had walked the perimeter of his camp. He had heard it. 2 legs, he said, unmistakably 2 legs. A slow, heavy tread all the way around the outside of the firelight and back again, 3 full circuits. And it never came in, and it never made a sound with its mouth. And in the morning there were no tracks because the ground was frozen hard, but the dogs had chewed through 2 leads trying to get away from the side of the camp nearest the trees. He said a bear will come into a camp because a bear wants your food. This did not want his food. This wanted to walk around the outside of what he had and count it. And then it took one thing, the best dog, and put it where he would be sure to find it. The bush pilot was in December. His name was Gil. He flew a ski-equipped Super Cub out of a strip near Katina, and he did winter work, hauling for trappers and running the occasional survey for the department, which is how I knew him. He came down to have coffee with me after a flight, and he was not himself. Gil was a talker, a joker, and he sat across from me quiet and turned his cup around and around, and then he asked me in a low voice whether I'd ever seen anything up in the drainage northeast of the highway that I could not explain. I asked him what he had seen. He had been flying the survey line at maybe 600 feet in the flat winter light, following a frozen lake up the valley, and he had seen something crossing the ice. He thought it was a moose at first because of the antlers, and then he understood that it was walking on 2 legs and that it was carrying something. He came around for a second pass, lower, and he saw it clearly against the white of the lake. It was upright and it was covered in dark hair, and it wore a rack of antlers off the skull, and slung over its shoulder, held in place by one long arm the way you would carry a duffel, was a full-grown caribou, carrying it, not dragging it, carrying 180 pounds of caribou across a lake at a walk on 2 legs. And Gil said the thing looked up at the airplane and did not break stride and did not hurry. It just watched him pass over and kept walking to the far tree line and went into it. And Gil said he flew home and sat in his truck at the strip for an hour before he could go inside. I asked Gil, because I had to, whether he'd gotten a look at the head. He said he had. He said the face was flat and wide and turned up to watch him, and that it was not the face of any animal. It was too much like ours. And that was the part he could not get past, that a moose or a bear looking up at your airplane looks like a moose or a bear. And this looked up at him the way a man on the ground looks up at a plane, with a kind of attention, a kind of judgment. He said he had flown that country for 15 years and never been afraid of it, and that after that day he would not fly the drainage anymore, and he traded routes with a younger pilot so he would never have to, and he never told the younger pilot why. 2 men now. 2 men had come to me quietly and asked me to name it, and I would not. And each of them had gone away carrying it alone, the way I was carrying it alone. And the thing about a secret like that is it makes you feel like the only person in the world until you find out you are one of a crowd of frightened people all keeping the same silence. That was the winter I started keeping the second notebook. The department book had the bare predations in it, the lie. The second book I kept at home, and in it I wrote what people actually told me and what I actually saw, and I dated every entry, and that notebook is the reason any of this can be told in order now. The next entry in that book is dated the 9th of January 1975, and it is not a sighting, it is a sound. There was a family homesteading at the mouth of the drainage. Decent people, a man and his wife and 2 half-grown boys, who ran a few dozen chickens and a milk goat and lived the way people did up there, off the road, off the grid, a long way from help. The man came to see me not because anything had been killed, but because for 3 nights running something had been calling from the ridge above his place after dark. And he wanted to know what animal made the sound, and he brought his oldest boy who had heard it closest. The boy described it, and I wrote it down word for word. He said it started like a bull moose, that low grunting call they make in the rut. And that was why nobody thought anything of it the first night. But it was January. There is no rut in January. And on the second night, the call changed, partway through, from the moose grunt into something with words in it, or the shape of words, a rising and falling, that the boy said sounded like a man trying to talk with a mouth that was not built for it. And then it dropped back into the moose call again, and the 2 sounds traded back and forth for an hour. The animal sound and the almost voice coming from the same throat on the same ridge. The goat died that week, not taken, not eaten, dead in the pen in the morning with its neck broken and its little horns snapped off clean at the base and set on the ground beside it, side by side, like a man had laid them there. The chickens were untouched. Whatever came into that pen in the night walked past 40 chickens it could have had for nothing and killed the one animal that had horns and took the horns and left everything else. And the family loaded their truck that same day and drove to Anchorage and did not come back for their goat pen or their chickens or the winter of firewood they had stacked. And I do not blame them, and I steered the man who bought their place the following year away from ever telling me if he heard the call too. I need to talk about the tracks, because the tracks are the part that changed it from a monster story into something worse. There was a man who came up every few years from Washington State, an amateur, a Sasquatch man, one of those fellows who spends his vacations casting footprints in the mud of logging roads and comparing them to the casts of other men through the mail. He had been coming to the Copper District for a decade because there was a good history of the big, hairy fellow up there, the Sasquatch, the one everybody has heard of. And I want to be clear, before that winter I put the Sasquatch men in the same drawer as the flying saucer men, and I was polite to them and I did not think about them because a warden meets every kind of person. This man, and I will call him by his line of work and say he was a surveyor by trade because that is what he was, came to my office in March very badly shaken, which I had never seen from him because his usual mode was a kind of cheerful obsession. He had been up a spur off the main drainage casting prints. Good prints, a clear trackway of the big hairy fellow that he was very excited about. A 500-pound animal by the depth of the impressions moving at a walk. And he had followed the trackway up the spur, casting as he went, the happiest he had ever been in his life. And then the trackway had stopped. Not faded out, not gone on to hard ground, stopped mid-stride, in good, soft substrate where the next print should have been as clear as the last one. And it was not there. And what was there instead, coming in from the side and overprinting the last clear Sasquatch track, was a single impression of something much larger, a track twice the size. And past that point, there were no more Sasquatch prints going forward. None. the trackway simply ended, and there was a long drag, and then the larger tracks went on alone up the spur and into the rocks. He understood what he was looking at, and it broke something in him. He had spent 10 years chasing the biggest, most frightening animal he could imagine was hiding in those woods, the king of the forest, the thing that ruled the country. And he had finally found where its trackway ended. And it ended because something had come out of the trees and taken it. The Sasquatch was not the top of anything. The Sasquatch, the great hidden giant that men like him had built their whole inner lives around, was prey. And whatever it was prey to had crossed the same ground he was standing on, and had done it recently and wore a crown. I asked him to describe the larger track for the book, and he did, and I have it in front of me. He said it was not shaped like the Sasquatch print, which is a broad, flat human foot. He said the larger track had a foot like ours in the heel and the arch, and then split at the front into two great toes, cloven like a moose or a deer blown up to a size no deer ever grew to. A foot, half man and half beast, and that the stride between the tracks was so long he could not walk it. He had to jump from one to the next and still come up short. He said he had cast one of the larger prints before his hands got too bad to work, and that the cast weighed as much as a paving stone, and that he had taken it home and buried it in his backyard because he could not stand to have it in the house and could not bring himself to break it. He did not come back to Alaska. I got one letter from him that summer, and all it said was that he had gotten out of the hobby and that he hoped I would be careful, and that he had burned the rest of his casts and kept only the buried one, and that some nights he could feel it down there in the ground under his lawn like a bad tooth. I want to put down the two hunters here because their story is the one that made me understand that the thing was seen and known by more people than ever admitted it, and that the not admitting was doing exactly what it was meant to do. They were local men, brothers in their 40s who had hunted that country their whole lives, and they came to me together in the fall of 1975 and told me a thing they had told no one else, not their wives, not each other really, because they had driven home from it in silence and not spoken of it for a month. They had been glassing a hillside at first light for a bull they had heard bugling the evening before, and they had found the bull, a good bull, out in the open across a draw, and they had been setting up the shot when the bull stopped feeding and lifted its head and went rigid, and then out of the black timber above it, moving fast, faster than either of them could believe. A thing that size could move, came the crown one. It took the bull moose down without a weapon. That is what the older brother said over and over, that it had no weapon, that it simply ran the moose down and got a hand on the antlers and turned the head. And a bull moose weighs 3/4 of a ton, and it turned the head the way you would turn the head of a dog, and the moose went down and did not get up. And then the crown one stood over it in the open in the good morning light, in full view of two men with rifles 400 yards away. And it looked across the draw directly at them, and it put one hand on the antlers of the dead bull, and it broke them off, both sides, and it set them on the ground. And then it looked at the two hunters again for a long moment, and the younger brother said it was not a look that wanted to kill them, it was a look that wanted them to understand something. And then it took the moose and went back into the black timber and left the broken crown lying in the grass in the sun. The younger brother never hunted again. He sold his rifles. The older brother still hunted, but he told me he would not hunt a bull with a big rack anymore, only cows and small bulls, because he had a feeling he could not shake that to kill a crowned animal in that country and pack out the antlers was to make yourself, for a little while, the largest thing wearing a crown. And he had seen what happened to the largest thing wearing a crown, and he was not going to be it. There is one more bead before the elders, and it is the one I have the least explanation for, and it is dated the last week of June 1975. A geologist and his assistant were up in the high country above the drainage doing survey work for a mining claim, camped for a week on a bench of bare rock above the tree line where they thought they were above everything, above the bears, above the moose, above the whole business of the valley. And they were not up there long enough to have heard any of the stories from below. They were flatlanders on contract. They did not know the valley had a name that nobody said. And the geologist came to my office at the end of that week before he flew out, not frightened exactly but unsettled in the particular way of a scientific man who has been handed a fact that does not fit. And he told me they had found a place on the bench that they could not account for. It was a ring of skulls, not fresh, old, some of them very old, bleached and cracked and half sunk into the thin soil, and every one of them was a skull that had carried antlers or horns, moose and caribou, and a few mountain sheep, and every one of them had the antlers or the horns broken off at the base, and they had been set out in a ring perhaps 30 feet across, broerage outward, facing out like a fence, like a boundary, like the wall of a place. And in the center of the ring, the ground was worn and packed the way ground gets under something heavy that comes back to the same spot over years. And there were no human artifacts anywhere near it. No fire, no tools, no shelter, nothing that a person would leave. Only the ring of broken crowns facing outward on a bare bench above the tree line where the geologist had believed there was nothing at all. He asked me what made it. He was a serious man, and he asked me the way a serious man asks, expecting a serious answer, and I gave him the only serious answer I had, which was that I did not know and that he should finish his contract quickly and fly out and not go back up to the bench. And he looked at me for a long moment, and I watched him decide not to ask the next question. And then he thanked me and he left, and his claim was never developed, and I have always assumed he made sure of that himself. I have thought about that ring more than almost anything else in the book because a kill is a thing an animal does, and a body arranged is a thing a clever animal might do. But a ring of crowns 30 feet across on a bench above the tree line, added to over years, broerage outward, facing the world like a warning it wanted read, is not something an animal does. It is something a person does. It is a person marking the edge of a country and telling everything with eyes what the rule is inside it, and the rule was written in the one language that everything in that valley could read, which was the broken crowns of everything that had ever tried to be king in it and lost. The testimony of the elders I have to handle carefully, because it is not mine, and because most of what was told to me was told in confidence, and some of it was told in a language I do not speak, translated by a younger relative who is doing me a kindness he probably regretted. There is a published record for anyone who wants to go and read it of the old people of the interior speaking about a being that lived in the high country and was not the big hairy man and was not a bear and was older than either. It appears in the accounts that outside scholars wrote down in the early part of the century, and I went and found those accounts later in the library in Fairbanks, because I needed to know whether I was the first person to see the thing or the 10,000th. I was not the first. I was not close to the first. What I was told in the office of a man I respected who had grown up on the river was that the crowned one belonged to a time before the people. He was careful with me about this. He said his own people had come into that country long ago and had found sign of it already there, and that their own oldest stories, the ones about the ancestors arriving, already had the crowned one in them as something the ancestors were warned about by whoever had been there before, and that there was no bottom to how old it was, that you could keep asking who came before and who warned them, and there was never a first people who had not already been afraid of it. He told me it was not a thing you hunted, and it was not a thing you fed, and it was not a thing you made a story about to frighten children. because it did not need to be made frightening and because making a story about it was thought to be a way of calling it. He told me the antlers were the sign of it and the sign of what it did, which was that it did not permit anything else in its country to be the largest thing, the strongest thing, the thing that wore the crown, and that when a bull grew too great a rack, or when the big hairy people grew too many and too bold in a valley, the crown one came and took the crown back and left the body arranged so that the message could be read by anything with the sense to read it. He told me one more thing, and he told it to me slowly, watching my face. He said the big hairy people, the Sasquatch, the ones the outside world had decided were the great mystery of the woods, were in the old understanding just another kind of people, a shy and clever kind who kept away from us, and that they feared the crowned one the way we fear it, and that in the very old stories the crowned one and the hairy people had a kind of arrangement, that the hairy people would leave a valley when the crowned one came into it, and mark the edge of its country for their own kind, and that a hairy person who did not leave, who was too bold or too old or too proud to give up a good valley, was the one you would find in a tree or find nothing of at all. The crowned one was not the enemy of the Sasquatch. The crowned one was the thing the Sasquatch had spent all of its long existence learning to get out of the way of, and had gotten so good at getting out of the way of that we had come to think the Sasquatch was the biggest thing in the woods, when all along the Sasquatch was just the biggest thing that let itself be seen. I asked him what it was called, and he told me, and I am not going to write the name down because he asked me not to, and because after everything I saw, I have come to think he was right that the name is a door, and you should not stand in a doorway calling through it. The worst night was in September of 1975, almost exactly a year after the first moose. I had by then become a man with two lives. In the day, I was Warden Callahan, who wrote bear on the forms and checked hunting licenses and gave the safety talks. And at night, I was the man with a second notebook and the growing certainty that there was a hole in the map of my district, a valley that the animals had abandoned and the trappers had fled, and that I had, without ever deciding to, stopped sending anyone into. I had begun to root people away from it. When a hunter came in for advice, I steered him south. When a survey needed flying, I found a reason it did not need to cover the drainage northeast of the road. I had made myself the warden of a place I was quietly emptying of people, and I told myself it was for their safety, and it was also that I did not want anyone else to see what I had seen, because as long as I was the only one, the whole thing could still be a thing that had happened to one tired man. But there was a hunter, an out-of-stater, a man named Marlowe, down from a guiding outfit that had no business being where it was, and he did not come to my office to be steered, he just went up the wrong valley after a big bull he had heard was up there. And he did not come back on his day, and his outfit called it in, and I knew before I put the phone down exactly which drainage he had gone up, because there is always a man who goes up the wrong valley. I went in alone. I have asked myself for 20 years why I went in alone, and the answer is that I did not want a search party in that valley. I did not want 6 other men seeing what I would see. I told myself I would find him, or find sign of him, and bring back whatever there was to bring. And the truth underneath that was that the valley was mine now, my secret. And I was going to go into my secret alone the way you go into a bad dream, because part of you needs to know how it ends. I went up the drainage in the last of the light, which was stupid, and I found the camp of the hunter intact. Tent up, fire long cold, rifle still in the tent, which told me most of what I needed to know, because a man does not leave his rifle. And there was one thing at the camp that I have never told anyone, and that I am putting down now only because there is no one left it can hurt. On the flat rock beside the cold fire ring, laid out neat side by side, were the 2 antlers off a bull moose, broken clean at the base, that did not belong to any moose the hunter had killed because there was no carcass at the camp and no blood and no drag. Something had made a kill somewhere else, taken the crown off it, carried the crown down to the camp of the sleeping man, and set it beside his fire where he would find it in the morning, the way you leave a calling card, the way you leave a warning that is also an invitation. And the man had woken and found it. And instead of running, he had picked up his rifle and gone up the valley toward whatever had left it, because he was a hunter, and that is what a hunter does. And that was the last decision he ever made. And past the camp, up in the burn where the whole thing had started a year before, in the blue last light, I found the crowned one. It was kneeling, that is the word, kneeling over something on the ground. And its back was to me, and the antlers rose off the bowed head against the pale sky, and the shoulders worked slowly at whatever was in front of it. And I stood at the edge of the trees the way I had stood a year before, and I could not make my legs do anything at all. The thing on the ground in front of it was not the hunter. It was a moose, a young bull, and the crowned one was breaking down the carcass with its hands, methodical, unhurried, arranging. And then it stopped, and it lifted its head, and it turned it, and it looked back over its own shoulder directly at me, and I saw the flat, wide face and the shelved brow and the reflective eyes catching the last light, and I saw on the top of the left ear the notch, the same notch. It was the one from the first clearing. It had known me for a year the way I had known it, and it looked at me across that burn with an expression I have spent the rest of my life trying not to understand, because it was not the expression of an animal. It was the expression of something that had decided a long time ago what I was, and had been waiting to see whether I had learned it too. It rose. It came up off its knees to its full height, and it was 7.5 feet of it, and the crown made it 9, and it stood over its kill, and it did not come toward me. And I understood that I was being permitted. I was being shown the thing and permitted to leave, the way you are permitted to leave a room by a man much stronger than you who has simply decided, for reasons of his own, not to stop you. I backed into the trees. I did not turn my back on it. I backed down the drainage in the dark for 2 hours with my heart going like a trapped bird, and it let me go. There was a moment on the way down, and I will put it here because it is the truest and the worst part, and I have never said it aloud. About an hour into the dark, well below the burn, I heard it following. Not hunting me, following at a distance, matching my pace, keeping to the trees off the trail, and once when I stopped, it stopped. And in the stopping, I heard it make the sound the homesteader boy had described. The low moose grunt that rose partway into the shape of words and fell back again once, quietly, close. And I have thought for 20 years about what those words almost were. And the closest I can come, and I know how it sounds, is that it was telling me to go home, that it was walking me out of its country the way you walk a lost child to the edge of your property and point him at the road, and that the kindness of it, if it was a kindness, was the most frightening thing that has ever happened to me, more frightening than if it had simply killed me, because a thing that kills you is an animal, and a thing that walks you home is a mind. The hunter, Marlowe, was never found. I filed him as lost, exposure. The country takes people every year and no one questions it. That was the last lie I told on his behalf, and I have carried him too. I have to tell the last part quickly because it is the part that is not about the crowned one. It is about the men who did not want the crowned one known. In the spring after that September, 2 men I did not know came to the district office. They were not from the department. They had the look of the government about them, but not any part of the government I had ever dealt with, and they were very polite, and they knew things about my file that the file of a warden does not contain. They knew about the second notebook. I had told no one about the second notebook except my own reflection, and they knew. And they asked me for it, and they framed it as a favor to me, as a kindness, that they would take these unfortunate notes off my hands so that they could not embarrass me at the end of a long career. They knew about Gil the pilot too, and about the surveyor from Washington by name, and they mentioned the family that had run to Anchorage as though they had already spoken to them. And it came to me while they sat there that I was not the beginning of anything and not the end of anything, that these two men, or men like them, had been visiting the people who saw the crowned one for a long time, quietly, politely, gathering up notebooks and casts and calling cards, and that somewhere there was a room with all of it in it, the buried cast of the surveyor dug up, the caribou survey Gil had flown, my dated pages, all of it filed under a heading I would never be allowed to read. I gave them a notebook. I want that on the record. I gave them a notebook, and it was full of dated entries in my own hand. And it was the wrong notebook. It was a decoy I had started keeping. The month the reports began disappearing from the office, because a man does not need to believe in monsters to notice that his mail is being read. The real book my daughter has. It is the one this account is built on. They thanked me and they told me the district was being reassigned and that I would be finishing my career at a desk in Anchorage, which I was 3 months later, and I never worked the copper district again, and I never went back up that valley, and I never saw the crowned one again, though I dreamed about the notch in its ear every winter for the rest of my life. I have thought a great deal about who those men were, and why a thing that hunts in a valley in interior Alaska would be worth a file, and 2 polite men, and the reassignment of an old warden. I do not have an answer. I have a suspicion, which is that I was not the first warden they had visited, and that there is a valley like mine in every range in that country, and that the reason you have never heard of the crowned one, the reason it is the big hairy fellow who gets all the television programs and all the plaster casts, is that the big hairy fellow is prey, and prey is safe to put on television. You do not have to hide the deer. You hide the thing that hunts the deer. You hide the thing that hunts the thing that hunts the deer, and you hide it well, and you visit the old men who saw it, and you take their notebooks, and you send them to Anchorage. I will say one more thing, and then I am done, and it is the thing I most want a person hearing this to carry away from it. For a year, I was afraid of the crowned one because I thought it was a monster, and monsters are frightening. And then in that burn in September, when it looked back at me over its shoulder and I saw that there was a mind behind the flat, reflective eyes, and again on the trail in the dark when it walked me out of its country, I stopped being afraid of it as a monster and started being afraid of it as a king. Because a monster kills you at random, and there is a kind of mercy in that, the mercy of meaninglessness. But a king looks at you and measures you and decides what you are and where you belong. And it had looked at me and it had decided that I belonged outside, on the road, at a desk in Anchorage, with my mouth shut, and it had been right, and it had gotten exactly what it wanted, and so had the 2 polite men. And I have never been able to tell the difference between them since. That is the account of Perry Callahan, or as much of it as he ever gave, and it ends the way he ended it to his nephew in 1994, which was not with a flourish, but with an old man at a kitchen table saying that he had spent 50 years of his life certain that the woods were only the woods, and that he had been wrong about the one thing he had staked his whole self on, and that the wrongness of it had never stopped feeling new. His daughter has the notebook. The surveyor from Washington burned his casts, all but the one buried in his yard, and got out of the hobby, and as far as anyone knows, never told the story to another living person. Ione trapped that drainage until she was too old to walk it, and then she stopped, and when a younger relative offered to take over the line, she told him no, that the line was closed and she would not say why. The bush pilot, Gil, flew for another 30 years and told the caribou story exactly once to Callahan and denied it ever after. The trapper, Doug, moved his line south and never moved it back. The family at the mouth of the drainage settled in Anchorage, and the two boys grew up, and one of them became a wildlife biologist, which the man who told me about it thought was a strange thing to become after a night like that, and which I think I understand. And the valley is still there, northeast of the road, grown over now, the burn come back to spruce, no trapline in it, no survey flown over it, a hole in the map that the animals still route around. If you went there and you found a bull moose down in a clearing with its crown broken off and its body arranged, you would have to decide for yourself what you were looking at, the way Perry Callahan had to decide, the way the surveyor had to decide when the trackway ended, the way every person in this account had to decide alone and in the dark.
Real or fake, you decide. I was Alex, thank you for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.